Hey, going, folks. This is Ryan Jackson Saw here with the Raw Report, and I'm talking to Topher Field. How you going, Topher?
I'm doing all right. I'm all set. I'm settled. I've got everything I need to have a very enjoyable chat, mate. Looking forward to it.
Beautiful. I'm just getting in touch because, well, I just heard you went through a bit of an incident recently, getting arrested for incitement charges. So
that was a week ago. That was a week ago today, and it already feels like ancient history. Time is flying. Yeah, I'd like to make it a much more interesting story than what it is, but the truth is the actual arrest itself was really quite dull and boring. They came to the door. They were at pains to be as nice as they could possibly be. You know, as I've said to others, they were the nicest human rights violators that I've ever met. You know, I stand by my view that they are participating in the violation of human rights, but credit where credit is due. They did go out of their way to be as inoffensive as possible. They were aware that I'm a dad with 2 young children, want to scare the kids. They thought about what they were doing in advance, and they did it in, I think, the best possible way whilst still actually doing it. Right. So look, it was only about 2.5 hours or so, and I was back home with the family with some bail conditions that I think were about as good as I was ever going to get. I didn't think that there was any point trying to dig my heels in and try and get any better bail conditions than what they offered in the first place.
Right. So it's good that you're still able to do the documentary, and that sounds very exciting. Are you ready to start talking about what exactly you're going to be doing with that doco?
Yeah, look, I can talk in terms of the themes that are in there and what we're looking to cover. My research team have literally until Friday to complete the research project. They've been working on this for a little while now. And they will be presenting me on Friday with a comprehensive timeline of everything that's gone on. And I will then be using that as my tool to map out and design, you know, what are the things that we really need to talk about, and how do I weave this together into a narrative and into a story that people are going to really resonate with and follow and remember, etc. So the key with any documentary, any film, etc., is to tell a story. I can't just be saying this happened and then that happened and then that happened. That's not the point here. We're having to actually tell a story. So the question becomes, what is the story? What actually matters out of everything that's happened?
Yeah, that's right. Well, we've seen some stuff in Australia over the last couple of years that I wouldn't have ever dreamed to see in this country. And it's actually gotten world attention. We got people from America, from England, everywhere offering their support for us, even protesting in the streets. So it's definitely
even Poland as well. We've seen that. But the stuff that's gotten the world's attention is mostly the protests, violence on the streets. And whilst that's important to acknowledge, and it will certainly be it will feature in the documentary, I would view that as a symptom, not as a cause. And what we want to understand here is what actually caused this. How did we go down this path in the first place? And that's really a story. That's theme number one of the 3 key themes of the documentary. Theme number 1 is all about Daniel Andrews and how his career has progressed and how he managed to amass and concentrate so much power onto himself. He has been able to do things that were thought impossible in a free democratic country. We're in a situation right now, as of last week, or this week, I think it might have been, where we have elected members of parliament who are not allowed to go into parliament and do their jobs. You know, this is an extraordinary moment in history where the results of an election are no longer. The people have their say, and then the government of the day gets to have its say on top. This is a really dangerous precedent to be setting right now, and I think a lot of people are missing just how serious a precedent this actually is. So that's the first theme, is Daniel Andrews and saying, well, how did he get all of this power? How did he get to the point where the parliament is sidelined, the police are politicized and doing as they're told? We've got the courts are basically neutered. The inquiries into his corruption, well, I mean, IBAC is doing some good stuff now, but the inquiry into the hotel quarantine was basically a whitewash. You know, how has he managed to become the Teflon man and concentrate all this power onto himself? That's theme number 1, because the world needs to know, needs to understand how that happened. We need to understand how that happened so that we can make sure that no one else does it again in the future.
That's right.
The second theme is around the media. and the media have been incredibly complicit. And when I say media, I'm talking about the dinosaur media, the dying media, have been incredibly complicit. Just yeah, just repeating all of the press releases. That a politician says something and they just repeat it. There's a real lack of rigor. There's a lack of skepticism. There's a lack of any sort of critical analysis. And they've become mouthpieces, basically just repeating data, repeating talking points from the government, and they've been shown up recently by new media. So probably the two best known would be Avi with Rebel News, and Rukshan as an independent journalist, just simply journaling what's been going on the streets of Melbourne. And we see situations where Channel 7's live feed from the protests might have 2,000 to 4,000 viewers, and Rukshan will have anywhere from 40,000 to 150,000 viewers. And you can clearly see who the people are actually identifying with and who it is that they want to, or that they trust, really, because that's what it comes down to. It comes down to trust. And what the people are saying is that they no longer trust the legacy media. They trust the individuals on the ground who are just there to try and journal and try and actually make a record and show the world what's happening. And so to both of those gentlemen, Avi and Rukshan, I think have done the world a huge favor, but have done Melbourne a huge favor. And in my opinion, they are basically, I would say probably more Rukshan. I think somehow the magic of live streams just did amazing things. And in the space of a week, the media went from calling the protesters a bunch of right-wing neo-Nazi, man babies, as I think it was Bill Shorten decided to, or baby Nazis, I think he wanted to call us. And then all of a sudden, within only a week, they were actually calling it what we are, which is anti-mandatory vaccination protesters.
Yeah, that's right.
And that change in language. That's right. And that change of language was no accident, and it was no coincidence that it coincided with the tradie protests and Rukshan being seen by millions of people around the world, just chatting to people and asking them why they were there, and proving beyond a shadow of doubt these aren't a bunch of making wannabe neo-Nazis, and they're not a bunch of right-wing nut jobs and racist whatevers. That they actually really were who they said they were, and the reason they were there was because they didn't force to take a medical procedure that they didn't personally feel comfortable with. That's really what it came down to, and that message would never have gotten out if it weren't for the independent media, the new media. So that's the second key theme.
I'm yet to see on any mainstream media any like live feed without any kind of narrative, which is trying to control the way people think about the protesters. They keep dropping certain phrases. It's almost like brainwashing in a way. But Rukshan, he's out there just with the camera, and you get to make up your own mind about what's happening. And I think that's extremely refreshing.
There's a funny saying. It used to be that the news told you what had happened and you had to decide what you thought. Now the news tells you what to think and you have to decide if it actually happened. They've become very much propaganda rather than actual information or education in any sense. And so then the third theme in the documentary is around the public pushback, the protests, the civil disobedience that's happened, and then of course the police reaction to that, which has escalated to the point that we've seen more recently with rubber bullets and riot police and armored vehicles and all kinds of like stuff that I've lived in the city since I was about 2.5 years and never thought that I would see that on the streets of my own city.
Yeah, that's right.
And certainly not 2 years ago, if you'd said to me that this is where we were going to be, I would have had you locked up. Like that's nuts. There's
something very interesting as well is looking at the case numbers of COVID positive people in places like Melbourne before the vaccine, mind you. It's basically non-existent. Yet these powers kept growing at an extremely rapid rate, and they seem completely disproportionate to the actual spread of this virus. I had the pleasure of talking to a few nurses actually, and they had some very interesting information very recently. They're saying that before the vaccines came out, there was maybe 4 or 5 cases in any hospital for the given year, despite hundreds of testings. And after the vaccine came out, the emergency wards are actually overflowing with vaccine injured people. And now we're seeing these massive cases in spike numbers. It doesn't make any sense.
Look, I'm not. I'm not really in a position to comment too deeply on the medical side of
Mm.
things. What I do know is from the data that we had some good back in March 2020. People think that, oh, we've only just recently really learned about this virus. No. In March 2020, Professor Nutwitkowski came out with a report. Professor John Ioannidis came out with a report. The Center for Evidence-Based Medicine came out with a report, and they were all coalescing around a pretty similar figure, that the infection fatality rate of COVID-19 is somewhere around about the 0.3% mark. Now, that's pretty serious. The flu, for reference, the official IFR for a typical flu is around about 0.1. So, we were looking at something that was 2 to 3 times deadlier than a normal flu. And that's, the flu kills a lot of people every year. And if you multiply that by 2 or 3 times, that's a lot of extra people. Right?
Of course, yeah.
And none of us want that to happen. And I think it's justified to look at it, in the early days before we had that data, certainly. And then even after that data came out, I think there was good reason to be really thinking about how do we respond. Like, having no response was probably wouldn't have been appropriate. I think the threat is serious enough that you go, okay, this needs to be met somehow. We need to respond somehow to this.
Certainly.
But the other thing the data shows very, very clearly, though, was how the risk changed with age. And we knew that the people at risk, almost not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, were people above about 60 years of age, and especially those above 70 and 80 years of age. And it's such now that the actual average age of death from COVID-19 is higher than our overall average age of death. Now, that makes sense because it's people who are already old that are getting it. It's people are like, oh, COVID's making people live longer. No, that's not how statistics works. By the time someone's 80 years of age, their life expectancy is no longer 82, 83, even though the overall expectancy is 82, 83, whatever it is. Once someone's reached 80 years of age, we already know that for that individual, they're not going to die in childbirth. They're not going to die as an infant. They're not going to get hit by a car playing with a ball when they're 5 years old. They're not going to die in a car crash when they're 18. They're not going to die in an industrial accident when they're 35. Like, there's all of these other people that die along the way that bring that average down. By the time you're talking about an 80-year-old, on average, they're going to live past the life expectancy, right?
Yep.
That's why we see exactly this happening, where the average age of death from COVID is higher than overall average age of death. That's because it is overwhelmingly infecting people who are already in excess of the average age of death. They've already made it to that point. And it's finishing those people, also overwhelmingly people with comorbidities. So these aren't deaths to be dismissed or taken lightly. Every death is a tragedy for those that know the person that's passed away. At the same time, these aren't the kinds of things, never before in history has a civilization seen fit to completely upend their lives and the lives of the young and those that are in their prime earning age, and people that are building businesses that are going to fund their retirements and everything else, the education of children. Never before in history have we seen fit to completely flip our entire world on its head for a virus that is killing people that are already in excess of the average age of life expectancy. I mean, this is the response. I think it's very hard to argue that the response was proportionate. Now, you said a little while ago that it seemed like, there were so few people in hospital, and yet the response was really draconian, and that didn't seem to match. There are people who would respond to that and say, yes, but we had so few people in hospital because the response was so draconian. They would actually argue causation and say, no, it's Daniel Andrews that saved us. It was because he locked down so hard and so early that we had so few case numbers. And to them, I say, actually,
it's a narrative so perfectly, doesn't it? Of course, in countries where we didn't have lockdowns, you don't see this. We see very similar case numbers.
Well, I would argue that they have half a point. Okay, I would say it's very hard to look at the data from Australia and from Victoria and say that lockdowns did nothing, right? It's very, very, other countries, particularly countries that have land borders, they tried lockdowns, and there's no statistically significant difference in their particular curves, okay, between countries that chose to lock down and countries that didn't. Australia, I think, is a little bit of an outlier because of just how ridiculously aggressive we went, and the fact that we have sea borders, not land borders. However, the mistake that these people make is thinking that Daniel Andrews was getting us through the pandemic. He wasn't. He was keeping us in the pandemic. There's a fairly fundamental issue here where we're not getting to the other side of this until it has ripped through 50% or so of the Australian population. right? Even with the vaccines, we now know the vaccines don't actually reduce your likelihood of contracting COVID and don't reduce your viral load and likelihood of passing it on. If they achieve much at all, it is almost exclusively that they reduce the likelihood of mortality for the individual who's been vaccinated. But that's a negligible impact on the actual spread of the virus itself. Now, this isn't surprising. This is something that Pfizer and AstraZeneca, et cetera, have talked about in their vaccines. They've talked about the fact that it's not designed to stop you from catching the virus or to stop you from necessarily passing it on. It just makes it less likely to kill you. This is public knowledge. And yet again, our media have, and our politicians have quite cynically, in my opinion, tried to pretend that the vaccine was the way out of the pandemic. Well, it has the potential to reduce mortality, but the way out of the pandemic is actually that about half of us get it.
I think that
the real question.
I think the idea that it will reduce mortality is extremely questionable, especially for those who've managed to find the animal trials for these particular types of vaccines. You'll find that the mortality might actually go up quite significantly, and we'll see over time. But it's an experimental vaccine. We don't really know yet.
That's one of those things that only the data is going to answer that question. You know, let me address one here that I am seeing. A lot of people are looking at it going, the majority of people dying from COVID have had are fully vaccinated, right? So therefore, the vaccines are actually increasing mortality. Well, no, the overwhelmingly the vast majority of people vaccinated were in the most vulnerable category, and so it makes sense. If you look at the distribution of who's vaccinated and who's not, and who's at risk and who's not, overwhelmingly the people who are at the most risk are also the most vaccinated. And so therefore, even if hypothetically, I'm not saying it is, but hypothetically, even if we halved their risk, they would still be overwhelmingly more at risk than the other people that haven't been vaccinated yet because they weren't the priority. So it is entirely possible to end up with a situation where the majority of people dying are fully vaccinated and the vaccine is reducing the likelihood of death at the same time. I'm not saying that's what is happening, but I'm saying the fact that the majority of people die are fully vaccinated is not actually a slam dunk proof that the vaccines aren't helping. So we need a lot more data. It's a matter of time will tell. We need a lot more data.
And that data is currently being held right now. And there are some politicians.
Well, in Australia, it is. That's right.
Yeah, there's some politicians that have been brave enough to call for that data to be released, and I certainly hope it is very soon, because how else are we going to be monitoring this for ourselves?
Yeah. That's exactly right. And transparency has been a big problem all the way through this, from the federal government, definitely. And that's what we're talking about there with the actual death statistics in Australia, but especially from the Victorian state government. They have made an art out of secrecy. They have been locking us down on this so-called health advice that we've never seen. The Victorian people have never been actually privy to and been allowed to see the health advice based on which our lives are flipped on their heads. In addition to that, anytime the government does anything, they have to do what's called a human rights assessment, where they need to actually go through and make sure that what they're doing isn't violating the fundamental human rights of Victorians, as articulated in the human rights and the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. And they have not published any of those human rights assessments publicly either. So we can't see the evidence in so-called science. We can't see the human rights assessments based upon which they say, yes, we're allowed to take away all of your rights and we've done the assessment and it's fine. Well, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen an enormous number of different contracts and things that have been awarded with private companies and private entities that have made a lot of money out of COVID. And now what we're seeing coming out with the IBAC hearings, which is probably the one silver lining of everything going on at the moment, is that the entire Labor Party machine in Victoria is basically built on various forms of corruption, whether it's branch stacking or every type of corruption you can imagine. That's pretty much what the whole thing is built on. And it's not a stretch to then say, well, that corruption probably continues to this day because those same people that were corrupt in how they got their positions of power are still there in those positions of power. It's the same people. So there are a lot of questions. There's an enormous amount of secrecy. And finally, thankfully, I think a lot of people are getting sick of that aspect of this and demanding to see answers. And they're not going along with this anymore. I'm seeing more and more civil disobedience all of the time. I was at a park today. I have to wear a mask now because I have bail conditions. I have to obey all the chose orders. Otherwise, I can be in breach of bail, which carries much more serious penalties. And I got 2 young kids, so I don't want to spend time in jail for no good reasons. So yeah, I'm now wearing a mask and doing all the crap. But honestly, there would have been probably 20 or 30 at time adults there, and maybe, including myself, maybe 5 of us had masks on. You know, and I'm just seeing this spreading, and there's just a lot more people that are just absolutely jack of it. And I think what it is they're finally just saying, this is not acceptable for me to have my life turned on its head for reasons that are being kept secret that I can't even see. And I'm just not going to go along with it anymore. I think a lot of people have reached that point.
I think it's almost been 2 years now. We're seeing that people aren't dropping dead all around us in the streets. And I think Australia is pretty much done with it. We're done. It's been 2 years. It's been too long now. Yeah, let us go. Stop locking us in.
And the vast majority, the vast majority of people went along with 2 weeks to spread. Right, I did, and the vast majority of people did as well, for a number of reasons. Number one, we didn't know what we were dealing with. This could have been as bad as what they were saying in the media that it was. Number two, 2 weeks of social distancing and reduced economic activity, etc., is very survivable. Right, it's very survivable. There's not a lot of businesses that would fail as a result of that. I mean, unfortunately, inevitably, there's always going to be some that are just right on the edge, and this becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. But the economic impact would have been pretty minimal. The disruption to people's lives, pretty minimal. The disruption to people's educations, pretty minimal. Their healthcare for everything other than COVID, all quite minimal, all quite manageable.
Absolutely.
And it was when that began to morph that I began to speak up. I didn't speak up until that began to morph, and you could see they're not going to keep their word. This isn't 2 weeks to spread to protect the healthcare system anymore. This has become something else entirely that we were never asked about and we never agreed to. That's when I began speaking up, and slowly over time, more and more people have reached their own limits and is beginning to speak up.
There's a couple of international plans which you don't hear talked about very often, which actually fit into this narrative quite nicely of what's happening. Some documents released in 2010, for instance. I'm not sure if you're comfortable talking about those on camera, but
look, I'm happy to talk about my sort of theory on conspiracy theories, and I've had to give this some thought because I have people putting things in front of me all the time. I get on some days I'll get 100+ messages to my Facebook page and emails and so forth, and a lot of them is people trying to draw my attention to various different things. And so I had to make a decision. I had to figure out what I wanted to do with all this stuff. And I came to the realization that it takes a lot of effort and it's very difficult to figure out whether a given conspiracy theory is true or not. And there are certainly things that have been put in the conspiracy theory basket that have turned out to be true. For example, I'll put my hand up and say I was one of the people that dismissed the idea that the virus came out of a lab. It just seemed like an unnecessary distraction. It was unnecessary noise. We know that viruses have come from bats in the past. There's no reason to think that wasn't the case again. Yeah, okay, they've got a lab in Wuhan. That could easily be a coincidence. So I pushed that one to one side. Turns out there's a 99 point something% chance that it did come from the lab, and I was completely wrong to dismiss it. So let me, in the context of what I'm saying, understand sometimes conspiracy theories do turn out to be right. So the decision that Sorry?
Oh, most certainly. And actually, it's the Pentagon, I believe, that released a certain document recently that indicates that this was actually a gain-of-function virus, and there was a plan to release it into the caves in Wuhan. That's a very compelling document, even though it has an unknown source. So it's hard to verify completely.
Yeah, and this is the problem with the nature of these things. So I designed a test, 2 simple questions that I ask myself. And if the answer is no to both of them, then I just put it to one side. So the questions are these. Can I actually verify this to any meaningful degree? Yes or no? And even if I could verify it, would it change what I do and how I live? If the answer to both of those is no, I can't verify it. And even if I could verify it, it wouldn't actually change what I do and how I live. I put it to one side.
Yeah.
You can put a lot of energy into researching these things and trying to, is this true? Is this not? There's all this information. Some of it might be good. Some of it's rubbish. Some of it's just people grandstanding and wanting attention and making up outlandish stuff because it gets clicks. And you've got to sort all of that, figure out what's what and who's who. And then all of that energy that you've invested into doing that is energy that you haven't spent on your family on your business, on the problems that are facing your immediate and local area that you can do something about. And so I've seen people just about ruin their own lives, feeling like they're on this higher calling, this amazing mission to uncover these conspiracy theories, but ultimately they can't do jack about them, even if they are true. And their marriage is falling apart. They're broke. They've got debt collectors knocking on their door. There's all sorts of things happening in their life that they had the power to control if only they'd invested their energy there instead. So that's where I sit with conspiracy theories. I largely don't even look at them because the vast majority of the time, the answer to both of those questions is no. I can't verify it. And even if I could, it wouldn't change anything. And therefore, I just park it to one side.
Well, I tell you what, if someone told me a couple of years ago that we'll be locked in our houses by the government, unable to travel without like electronic passes and masks and everything that's going on, I would have called that a conspiracy theory, absolutely.
100%,
but here we
and
are.
I would have joined you. Yeah. And these are very, very challenging times for so many different reasons. They're challenging because of just what's going on. They're challenging because of how deeply it forces us to question our sense of identity and who we are and what it means to be an Australian and what it means to live in a free country. There's a lot of soul searching going on, and in the end, actually, I view that as a silver lining. I think there's a lot of people are getting politically active for the first time in their lives.
Yeah, it's a wake-up call.
We have a very we have a very she'll be right attitude in Australia when it comes to politics. Rational ignorance is the expression for it, where people just look at it and go, well, a little bit like what I just did with the conspiracy theories. I wouldn't be able to do anything about it. I'm only one vote out of 25 million. So it doesn't really matter. All the energy that I would pour into it would be pretty much wasted effort. So I'll ignore politics. And there's a lot of people who are suddenly being jarred out of that because they're realizing that just because you ignore politics doesn't mean that politics is going to ignore you. And they're now facing that rather uncomfortable. So the silver lining and my hope out of all of this is that, through things like my documentary and just the reality of people living in the way that they've been forced to live, we're going to see a huge increase in political engagement in this country.
Yes, absolutely.
Because if we're going to find our way back out of this wilderness, it's going to take a group effort, and it's going to take a lot of effort from a lot of people who up until 18 months ago were much more interested in footy than they were in politics.
They were, but I think this is going to be the next election is going to be extremely interesting. I think we're going to see the rise of the independents, and that should basically, it's going to change the parliament up a little bit because the power dynamics will be shifting. I think it might actually make a bit more of an honest parliament because they'll realize probably for the first time in a long time that they have to really work hard for the people. Otherwise, they're just going to lose their seats. And that hasn't happened yet, but it's going to start happening now.
Well, we got a preface of that in the last New South Wales state election. And obviously COVID had nothing to do with that particular election, but that was around water issues and the fact that the Nationals are seen by people in the southern Darling Basin to not be representing their interest anymore. And so we saw significant gains from One Nation, from Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party, and from, I think it was United Australia Party as well, and maybe an independent as well. I don't remember exactly. Took a number of lower house seats in the New South Wales state parliament. I think it was 4 seats in all. And I know that there is a concerted campaign from those same parties and a number of independents to try and do the same thing in the upcoming Victorian election. Again, not related to COVID, actually just the existing issues with the water mismanagement that's been going on. When you add COVID on top of that, and the fact that now there's a lot of city seats, particularly out of metropolitan seats, I think that have come into play. A lot of the inner city seats are pretty rusted on. They're pretty, they're going to vote Liberal, they're going to vote Greens, they're going to vote Labor, whatever it might be. And I that also tends to be the demographic that has been less affected by all the lockdowns. They earn their money off their laptops, or they're retired, or whatever it may be. Out in the outer metropolitan area, the outer suburbs, that's where people are younger. They're still having to earn. They're still having to show up to work. They're blue collar often. And these are also seats that tend to swing a little bit more in the first place. And these are the ones that I think have really come into play. The ultimate goal, the hope would be neither the Labor Greens coalition, because let's be honest, they are a coalition, nor the Liberal Nationals coalition can actually form government. right? If neither of those is able to actually claim a majority in the lower house in their own right or as a coalition, then they have to negotiate with somebody else just to become premier. See, people, we talk about the crossbench, but the crossbench in the context of Victorian right now is only in the upper house. So they have to negotiate with the crossbench in order to get legislation passed, because it has to go through both houses. But the premier comes from the lower house and is voted for by the MPs in the lower house. So what that means is, if we can take away their balance of power or their outright majority in the lower house, then all of a sudden they have to come along on hands and knees begging not to get your support to pass some legislation, but to get your support so that they can be premier in the first place. Right?
Yeah.
And if there are, let's say, 3 or 4 freedom-loving lower house members that are going to work together as a bloc and work together as a group, then they absolutely hold the parliament by the balls.
Yeah.
Right. They have.
That'll make me please this punch, to be honest.
Yeah. And that I think is that's the outcome I think we should all be hoping for the most.
I honestly think that we're going to get it the next election. I don't think that there's going to be a majority house from either one of the major parties. Not this time around.
I hope you're right.
Not after the shambles that we've seen in the last few years. No.
Look, I hope you're right. I've been doing this for 12 years, and sorry.
Oh, I'm saying what I'm worried about though is the massive amount of debt that's been racked up over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
If people want to check that, that's good to have a look at, because we may be heading towards a recession just based on that debt alone.
I'm going to go further than that. Before COVID, Australia was already completely stuffed financially, completely stuffed.
Yeah.
I would say that Australia is the caboose at the end of a very long train that's headed towards a cliff. At the front of that train is currently China. People think it's the US. It's actually China. The US is tied directly to China, and when one goes over the cliff, the other goes with them. And then there's going to be Europe, and then there's going to be a bunch of other places. And Australia is relatively sheltered, and we've been very lucky with recent recessions: 2008, 2000 .com bubble, Asian financial crisis, all that stuff. We've ridden that out really quite well. But just because you're the last carriage to go over the cliff doesn't change your destination. You're still going over that cliff, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And I think we were in serious trouble. I think we were in serious financial trouble before COVID came along. We're in a situation now where we have structural deficit spending. It is almost impossible for us to get back into the black in terms of just on a year-by-year basis, let alone pay off the debt. In addition to what's happening on the budget, there's a whole bunch of spending that's happening on budget, which means our position is actually worse than it looks. And then you add to that the fact that we have 50% of Australian households now, actually more, that are depending on some form of government payment or handout in order to make ends meet at the end of the month. Now, what that means in a democratic country, when you have a 50% welfare dependency rate, how does anyone get elected if their policy is to cut spending and reduce welfare and balance the budget?
Yeah, goodbye, Liberal.
That politician can't get elected.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Oh, well, look, the Liberals don't believe in low taxes and small government at all. But you end up with a situation where no one can actually stop the train, right? That train is heading to that cliff and no one can stop it. Now, it might still be a decade before we reach the cliff. I'm not saying it's about to happen, although I think with all the COVID stuff, it's probably sooner rather than later now. But people sort of go, oh, the cliff is a long way away. Okay. How are you going to change direction sometime between now and when it's no longer a long way away? Let's talk about that, because it doesn't matter how far away it is. If we keep going towards it, eventually we reach it. And I can see any possible exit point anymore. The only exception being a massive political awakening, which without COVID, there was zero chance of that happening. Without COVID, there was absolutely no chance that Australian people were going to engage politics in large enough numbers to understand the problem and then vote accordingly, even if it costs them some welfare or something like that, to actually recognize, no, this is a bigger problem than just my household budget. And we need to cut spending. We need to balance the budget. And I'm going to support the people that will do that. Awakening was never going to happen without something like COVID.
Australia itself has been riding the gravy train for, over 100 years now, just where we have been better off than almost every other country on earth. So of course we're going to be apathetic. Of course we're going to expect that life is going to stay this good, forever. But unfortunately,
Yeah, forever. Correct.
um,
Yeah,
but
and that's our downfall.
There are options. Well, we still have an opportunity before a major economic crash. Why don't we start investing into manufacturing? Why don't we start investing into higher tech development and start actually having a lot more countries depending on Australia for more than just more raw minerals? Because if the countries out there crash and they're not buying up our raw minerals, we're going to crash too. But if we're giving them technologies that they need to sustain themselves, then we might have a chance to maintain them.
So let me suggest a slight adjustment to the language there. I don't think that we, as in Australia, should be investing in anything at a government level. What we need to be doing is looking at why lose manufacturing in the first place. Why don't we have server farms and big tech companies based here? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, our cost of living is stupidly high, which means our wages are stupidly high, which means the cost of doing business is stupidly high. Our real estate and our buildings are incredibly expensive. And so if you want to do a server farm in a massive warehouse, it's cheaper to do almost anywhere else in the world than what it is to do over here. Our power is ridiculously expensive. That rules out kind of server, any kind of software as a service type business is just gone instantly. Along with most manufacturing, because after wages, usually manufacturing, their biggest cost is power. And so when you have some of the world's most expensive energy prices and some of the world's most expensive salaries and some of the world's most expensive real estate, you end up in a situation where no one can manufacture here and compete. No one can provide software as a service here and compete with people that are doing it elsewhere. So I would say, yeah, we want to bring back manufacturing. We want to bring back technology, but we've got to do it actually reducing the input costs, not by some government program or whatever else.
Well, we can do that with automation. So that's the key to the future higher tech development, automation.
Sure, but automation isn't exclusive. Other people can also automate and still have a lower cost base in all other respects. Automation requires power, for instance. I think we've got to reduce the cost of our power. We've got to halve it or better before we're even going to begin to look attractive to a lot of companies. Taxes are another issue. The amount of red tape, the amount of time it takes from when you decide you want to do something to finally get the government's permission to do that thing. All of these are considerations for any company that's operating globally. And Australia is really poor in all of those respects.
Yeah, that's right. We still have a long way to go. We are a young nation and we're about to face a challenge that we haven't really faced for a long time, not since the 1920s, since the last Great Depression. But our ancestors got through that and we'll get through it as well. I think that's generally good advice, I think, with people to set themselves up in the country, if they can get out there and start growing some food and vegetables and collect rainwater, look after your bare necessities. It safeguards really nicely big crashes like this.
Yeah, look, I think for anyone for whom that's an option, I think so. And I mean, I've talked about this in the past in some of my slow chats, my content. Most of us, if we lost all services, power, water, sewerage, no flushing toilets, no internet, no communications, etc. Most of us would have to leave the house within 48 hours in search of water. Right? We couldn't do 48 hours in the house and we would have things to drink. But remember, there's another 4.5 million people in the city of Melbourne, 6.5 million people around the state of Victoria that are also now leaving their house looking for water. Right? And good luck.
Yeah.
So I kind of have a philosophy of the option to sit at home for 30 days. Right? If something goes pear-shaped and something goes horribly wrong, a coronal mass ejection causes a massive grid collapse, right? It's feasible. We know that the Earth has been hit by huge coronal mass ejections from the sun in the past. We know that in the modern world, if the same thing were to happen, it is very likely to disrupt the grids.
Yep.
Yeah. If your side of the Earth is facing the sun when that hits, grid goes down, computers stop working, phone is fried, the whole lot's down, and it's going to take months or years for some of that stuff to come back up. I mean, restarting a grid is not the word moment, especially restarting a grid in a world that's just gone dark. Good luck, right? I mean, it's going to be a long time before that power comes back on. So having a reserve of dried foods, having a way to cook those foods, having an energy so you can cook them, having water to cook them in, and then jars of things that just meet the most basic human nutritional needs. I mean, I'm not talking 3 Michelin hat, cuisine here. I'm talking survival stuff. Thinking about your sewage. How are you going to get your poop out of the house? For 30 days, if you can't flush, how are you going to not get sick? Because, you look at World War I, more people died of infections and poor hygiene than actually died from the combat itself in the trenches of World War I. You take away sewage and running water and electricity from most people's homes, they're going to get really unhygienic within just a couple of days. And most people haven't even thought about what they would do. I hope I never need any of this sort of preparation, but I think in today's world, there's very little downside. There's very little cost to having thought about it and having at least sort of 30 worth of survival in place, so that you're not having to hit the road in 2 days. You can wait that out and let that phase of madness, whatever, play out before you then have to hit the road. If you want to head up to the country, head towards where they grow food. I mean, if you live in a country area, you don't necessarily have to have all the food yourself. But if you live close to, apple orchards and grain growers and etc., beef and all the rest of it, if you've got relationships and you've got something you're willing to work, to sing for your supper, then you're not going to run out of food, right? Because all that food is being grown to send to the city. All the transport stops. It's no longer going to the city. Where's it going? Well, it's still there. It's back at the place it's being grown. It's hanging on the trees or sitting in the ground or sitting in barns and silos and boxes, and it's all sitting there. And you just need to be have relationships in those communities and be the kind of person where you have skills and knowledge that's useful in that world, and you can then barter and you'll never run out of food.
Well, we're very lucky to be in Australia because we actually have quite a low population to land mass, even though you got to say a lot of the land mass is desert. So, but the Aboriginal people, they survived in the desert for tens of thousands of years is doable. I think it would be okay. It'll just be a big change.
It's probably not doable for me. Dropping me off in the desert, I'm probably not going to make it.
Probably wouldn't make it.
In all honesty, don't put your money on me.
Well, if you ever get stuck in the desert, just follow where the birds are flying because they're going towards the water.
Well, there you go. So the document called Battleground Melbourne, and the byline is the fall of the world's most livable city through the eyes of those that risked everything to save it. So this is really, it's our side of the story. The government has told its side of the story through press conferences and whatever. The media have put out all of their lies and manipulations. The police have been able to say whatever they jolly well wanted, and the media would just repeat it for them. This is our reply. This is us setting the record straight and saying, actually, we've been called all kinds of things. Tell you who we are and why we've done what we've done and what actually happened. And it follows the 3 themes I talked about before, how Daniel Andrews has managed to concentrate power onto himself and become, he now has the ability to operate as a dictator if he chooses to. And I think, it's my personal opinion that he is doing exactly that. But even if you disagree with that, it's pretty much indisputable. He now has given himself the ability to operate that way if he wants to. This wasn't supposed to be possible in a place like Victoria. It's not. We're supposed to have checks and balances and separations of power. It's not supposed to work this way. So how did we get here? That's theme number 1. Theme number 2 is all about the media and their lies, and the fact that the new media and the rise of new media has really held them accountable. We've seen that on the streets and how it's been reported. And then finally, the 3rd major theme is all about the pushback, the protests, the civil disobedience, the police response, the escalations in violence, etc. What I didn't say before is that it's all aiming towards a message. And the message that we want to bring is a message of reconciliation. And we want to be laying the groundwork to be able to move past what's happened. We've become incredibly divided. Families are divided, workplaces are divided, communities are divided. And that division, I think, is 100% the responsibility of Daniel Andrews. That's his legacy. His legacy as a leader of our state is absolutely unprecedented division. And I wipe that legacy away. I just want to get out a high pressure hose and just be like, and just get that legacy gone as fast as we possibly can and relegate him to history as fast as we possibly can, not just premier, but actually wipe away the damage that he's done. So the focus documentary is to be honest, and we're not trying to whitewash anything. We're not putting on rose-colored glasses. We need to really have an honest look at what's happened, and a lot of bad things have been done, and we need to be talking about that. But we also need to be talking about it in not for the purpose of getting angry and wanting to get even, but for the purpose of finding a way forward. How do we move on from what's happened and get to the point where we can talk to our neighbors again, where we can talk to our family members again, where the police can have a good relationship with people like myself who have been engaged in the protests and so forth. So that is really the message and the focus. And we don't have the answer for that necessarily in this documentary. I don't think anyone knows for sure what the answer to that is yet, but I want a foundation and start asking the right questions and people thinking about the right things. So that's what the documentary is.
Wonderful.
We are fundraising at the moment. So we have reached we've reached our minimum budget, which was $65,000, which if you've had anything to do with film industry, you know how documentaries work, you know, that's a pretty minimal budget. The commercial budget on this is around about $210,000.
Right. So if our listeners want to support and to help you out, where's the best place for them to go to make donations to make this documentary really work?
Sure. So it's a website called givesendgo.com/battleground Melbourne. That's a bit of a mouthful. So the better way to do it is going to be to go to my Facebook page or go to my Instagram. You'll find the links there. If you just scroll back through some recent posts or have a look at my bio in Instagram, you'll find the link there. It's givesendgo.com/battleground Melbourne. And at this point, you know, all of the budget that we can raise is going to be needed and used. And yes, we've met the minimum budget, so we're going ahead. It's on. It's happening. But the more budget that I can raise, then the more hours I can buy essentially from top quality editors, you know, color graders, audio engineers, composers, etc. All the different professionals whose services are needed to make a good documentary. I mean, I'm talking something that you would watch on Netflix, you would watch on a cinema screen, you know, like a Michael Moore documentary. I don't like his content necessarily, but people pay good money and they go and watch them in cinemas, right? That's the standard that we're aiming for. That's the standard that we want to work to. But that requires professionals are being paid professional money to do a professional job. And the more budget I have, the more hours I can give to those people.
Wonderful. And so that all those details are going to be down below this video. And we encourage you all to go there, support Topher. Let's get this documentary made because it's going to be absolutely amazing. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And it's been a great talk. We covered a range of topics and excellent. So we're going to keep the fight up and we'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I do appreciate it. And I'm sorry to have to call it at 9:30, but you can probably tell by looking at me, I am exhausted and I'll be going straight after this, but I do appreciate it so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Topher.
Cheers.